Welcome to this workshop on integrated pest management for the modern gardener, part 1, presented by Master Gardeners of Nevada County. Here is our presenter, Bonnie Broad.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who showed up today to hear a little bit about integrated pest management for today. We have so many topics to talk about, and I will give this a try to get this done in time for you to be able to tune in to our radio show at 10 o'clock and be able to ask some questions there too. Now, as far as the history of pest control, basically you stop and think about it, and it started when the first humans swatted the first mosquito. And that was probably a really long time ago, and there wasn't a whole lot that they could do back then, thousands and thousands of years ago, except swat those mosquitoes or try to stay indoors or use nets to keep them away. Now, a little bit more modern is those who sprayed the first mosquito, because that would be the beginning of another aspect of pest control. Or for those people who invented agriculture about 8,000 years ago, or maybe even a little longer. And as you can see, this gentleman who is doing one of the very first plantings of a field with the help of his domesticated animal is trying to plant a crop, and as soon as he does, you can see all of these insects that were already there are all going to be waiting in the wings to help him eat his crop. And back then, about all that he could do is plant more than he needed, so that there would be enough to share with the pests that were going to be there without him being able to do a whole lot about it. Now, as far as the history of pest control since then, I'll give you a few highlights. Obviously, throughout the thousands of years that we've been doing this, pests have always been there, and people have tried a million different things to try to keep them at bay. Starting at about 2500 BC, individuals began to use sulfur compounds, one of the oldest chemicals people were using to control mites and insects on crops. And that particular compound, sulfur, is still being used today in order to control pests on grapes and other crops. And so that had a long, long history. About 1200 BC, individuals in China began to use botanical insecticides as fungicides for seed treatments, and probably also to treat insect pests themselves. Botanical insecticides are those that are derived from other plants. For example, squashed up chrysanthemums are a pretty good insecticide. They are the basis for the modern pyrethrins. And other types of plants extracts have also been very helpful. Moving up a little in history, at about 200 BC, individuals began to use oil sprays to control pests. And again, this is still used today in, for example, winter dormant oil spraying to control aphids and scale and the types of insects that overwinter in the trees, where it's very helpful to use these sprays in the winter during the dormant season. At about 400 AD, now as we're moving forward, farmers began to apply arsenic to the roots of the rice in the rice paddies to help prevent insect infestations, and probably also began to poison themselves, which is unfortunate, but they didn't know any better at the time. And I'm sure it worked as a pretty good insecticide. In about 1100 AD, the Chinese began to use soap as a pesticide, which, as probably all of you know, is still being used today. And in the 1600s AD, Tobacco infusions, nicotine based, of course, herbs and arsenic became the major materials used for insect pest control, many of which have been discovered to be toxic to people. And so at the time, this was not known, and they had to use whatever tools they had at the time. But this particular compound takes a stellar place in the history of pest control, and that is DDT, diphenyl trichloroethane, which was one of the major pesticides for close to 100 years and is actually still being used today. But it was first synthesized back in Germany in 1873 by a German graduate student, and then Paul Muller, a Swiss gentleman, discovered its insecticidal activity somewhat later. It was very effective, very cheap to make, and long lasting. Oh boy, was it long lasting in the environment. It was, back in the early part of the 20th century, used widely, especially by the military, during and after the war for control of various different diseases that were transmitted by insects. Malaria, typhus, body lice, plague, etc. In Europe, in the South Pacific, malaria was a terrible problem for the soldiers during the war, and the utilization of DDT to actually not only spray the environment, but spray the people did a huge job of reducing the number of malaria cases that were being suffered by not only the soldiers, but locals in the various areas where this was being used. Malaria cases fell from well over 400,000 in 1946, which would be right after the war, to almost none in 4 or 5 years later. It saved so many lives and reduced so much suffering just from malaria that Mr. Muller won the 1948 Nobel Prize for Medicine for his discovery in this area. And this particular chemical, DDT, is still used in various countries in the world for this purpose. It is absolutely efficient at controlling the malaria mosquitoes in Africa, in India, many of the countries in Africa, and today is still being used there to reduce the suffering, human suffering and death from these diseases. It's a very difficult thing to understand and to debate, but that's what's happening still. This is some pictures that shocked the heck out of me when I first saw them, but this is absolutely what was happening even in this country in the 40s and 50s. There were actually neighborhood spray programs where trucks would go through and emit huge fogs of DDT to help control the pests, either in people or in the yards and the mosquitoes that they believed would be causing disease and wreaking havoc. And this was one way that was very popular back in the day. And as you can see in that bottom picture, little children would be playing in the fog banks of them because it was considered that it was good for them, that it would remove body lice and pests that would cause problems with their health. So this is what was happening, something that most of us today would shriek if we saw this happening, but this was happening then and happened until the 1960s when this book was published. 1962, Rachel Carson, a lady from Pennsylvania, a biologist, published the book Silent Spring, and she brought to the forefront the issue of pesticide safety, in particular DDT, to the attention of the public. It was a history-making book. It was a bombshell. She had a lot of people very angry because of this book, and she also had a lot of people that were shocked into wondering, hey, is this true? She described the entry of DDT into this into the system, the natural world, and how it resides in fatty tissues in the organisms in which it resides, and how it works its way up through the food chain into the supplies of milk and foods, and some of the damage that it did to the animals in the ecosystem that people had never noticed. And President Kennedy, president at the time, created a commission to study what this lady had brought up, to see whether or not this was true and whether or not this was something that we needed to pay attention to. And sure enough, they discovered that it was true, what the lady was saying. And so 10 years later, in 1972, DDT was banned permanently in this country and still is not used anywhere in this country, although it is used in other areas of the world. In 1972, when I was actually in school in UC Davis studying entomology, a new concept began to be thought of and invented called IPM. And IPM means Integrated Pest Management. It means don't count on one tool to do the work. Use all the tools on your tool belt and keep them as low in toxicity as possible. So as it says here, it's an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term, not one day, spray one day, get rid of all the pests that day, and don't think into the future. It's long-term prevention of pests or pest damage, and combine the techniques. Use as many techniques as you can and put them all together into a program, and they will work better as a program. And pest control materials are selected for their low toxicity and applied in a manner to try to keep them as safe as possible. One of the things that's very important for us, the gardeners, to learn, and this is hard, this is really hard for some people, is to look at your garden with new eyes. Now, when you look right here, for example, I hope you can see this arrow. When you look at this rose and see what there is here, you need to learn that when you see this many aphids, usually at the beginning of the season, when they have first come awake from their winter hibernation and are looking for food, do not look at them and see nothing but, oh my gosh, they're going to kill my rose, or oh, I won't have any roses at all. You need to look and see this. You need to see the ladybug. She's ready. This is my own backyard, and I took this picture. And she and her offspring and her friends, the syrphid flies and the lacewings and the pirate bugs and all the other critters that eat aphids, are all going to come to your garden as long as you don't use these guys as an excuse to run for the pesticide spray and try to kill them. Because if you do, you will probably either kill her, or you will also reduce her food source to the point where she will either die or leave your garden, and that's not the idea. You need her, you need all of her friends and her family to come and help you, because they will. Within a week or two after I took this picture, all there were more ladybugs there and all the aphids were gone, and I had beautiful roses. So it's a hard thing to do, I know, but when you see the aphids, don't use that as an excuse to bring out the sprays and even worry about it. I don't even look anymore. I don't worry about whether there's a few aphids in my garden, and that way my garden doesn't have a problem with pesticides because I don't use them, although there is a place for them in certain areas. But you need to appreciate that just a few pests isn't really going to be a problem. Now today, we're going to talk about cultural controls, which is the first of the three main areas of IPM. Cultural controls, mechanical controls, and biological controls. The last two we'll talk about next Saturday, and I hope you all will join us then. I'd love to have as many people as we can to move into this area and really understand. But cultural controls is how to grow healthy plants, because the healthier your plants are, for whatever reason, they will resist pest damage. And remember, the sicker they are, the more they will attract pests. Plants actually send out chemical messengers into the air when they are sick. And it's sort of a natural phenomenon where the plants are screaming out into the air, I'm sick, I'm dying, come eat me. And that's exactly what the pests are going to do. So the idea is to try to keep the plants as healthy as possible. Now, these are the areas of cultural controls that we'll talk about today. And crop rotation would be the first. The proper use of fertilizers or soil amendments, which, by the way, are two different things. Tilling and cultivating. Proper watering. Use of resistant varieties of plants, plants that are resistant to various diseases or insects. Adjustment of planting or harvest time, considering what the insect's life cycle is. And at the end, sanitary practices, which mainly come into use at the end of the season when you need to clean up the garden so that you can keep the amount of pests that overwinter in the litter to a minimum. So let's start out with crop rotation. I'm sure you've probably all heard of this before, but you do need to rotate your crops. That means to plant different crops in different areas of your garden from year to year, because many pathogens, which is the organisms that cause disease, and pests, by the way, will infect all the crops in the same family. Down below, we have the tomato family, which is the tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, etc., the nightshade family. And many pathogens and pests will infect all the members of this family. So you really are asking for trouble if you plant tomatoes in the same area year after year. Many of the pathogens and pests overwinter in the soil. And what happens when you plant the same thing, the same kind of plant next year in that same area, the pests and pathogens don't even need to move to find their host plant. You are planting that plant right on top of them, and they are finding it very easy to then infest your new plants. So try, if you can, to maybe you can put in an extra deep bed, an extra raised bed if possible, and move plants, families of plants from one area to another. Tomato family, for example, could be followed by the onion family or squash or the legumes, the bean family. And rotate between families at least every couple of years, preferably every 3. You can even plant a cover crop over the summer and especially, of course, over the winter in areas of your garden which you don't have any other plans for at the moment. And that will do nothing but improve the soil that you are growing in. And it's a great idea if you can do that. So crop rotation is really, really helpful. Now, cultural controls, proper use of fertilizer and soil amendments. So as you can see on the top, I'm trying to sort of illustrate here what fertilizer is. Fertilizer is chemical addition, usually in the form of granules, of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, etc., micronutrients, various different types of chemical additions to your soil when your soil might be deficient in them. But it's not something that you should be adding to your soil unless you know your soil is deficient. Because, for example, if you add too much nitrogen to a soil that already has nitrogen, then you are going to be asking to grow plants that have a lot of leaves and not that many flowers. And the same thing goes for other types of micronutrients and things like magnesium and phosphorus. You should have your soil analyzed to see what it may be deficient in before you start adding fertilizer willy-nilly to the soil. You can see that you can add fertilizer in a small area, or you can add fertilizer in a large area, for example, a lawn with large fertilizer application techniques. I'm not encouraging a lawn up here, but nevertheless, this is the way that people will apply fertilizer in a large area. Now, down on the bottom, you have scoops of beautiful compost, and compost is different. Compost is a type of soil amendment, and it is not fertilizer. Compost may have nitrogen in it and phosphorus and potassium, and it may have other things, but it is primarily used to build the structure of the soil, to allow soil aeration, to have pockets of air in the soil so that it's not like the clay that we have here, which can be, that has no air in it at all. It is solid clay, mud. It's almost like you could make pots out of it. That's the kind of soil many of us have, and that kind of soil needs compost because it will definitely help aerate the soil, and that's a big problem in some of our areas. Now, one other thing that compost does is to help to hold water into the soil, which if you have a lot of clay, that really isn't a problem because clay is very good at holding water. But when it comes to compost, compost is not something that you can overdose the soil with. It's almost as though you can't have too much compost. So go ahead and you can make it yourself. You can buy it in bags, but go ahead and apply compost either mixed into the soil or on the top as a mulch. And that is a very helpful thing for your plants. And you can do it year after year. As you know, those of you that have raised beds, the levels of the soil tends to go down as you grow things year after year. So you do need to add some amendments to those beds to keep them going. Now, we'll talk about cultivation versus tilling. That's two different things also. On the left, you can see some of the tools that you would use to cultivate an area. You can dig the soil and turn it over, and that helps to aerate the soil, and you can actually expose pests that are buried to the air or to birds that will come in and munch them. Or you can bury them if they need to be on the top or are on the top, which then that can break up their life cycle and kill them. You can break up a crust that's on the surface, and gentle cultivation with these particular tools that you see allow worms to live, which hopefully are in your soil, aerates the soil layers, allows penetration of water, and maintains the soil web. A whole bunch of organisms beneath the soil that are all connected to each other. And if you go to tilling, which is on the right, generally with a rototiller, you can destroy the soil web and kill worms. And this is probably one of the two main reasons why we do not encourage tilling after the initial development of an area. So if you are trying to garden in a brand new area and it's nothing but clay and rocks and hardpan, you can mix your organic matter down into the new areas with a rototiller. That's fine. It helps aerate the soil layers and gets you started. But don't continue doing it year after year. You don't have to. And it increases erosion of an area if you continue to do it, the formation of hardpan, since it doesn't go down very deep, and it destroys the soil web, kills worms, etc. So we encourage cultivation, although no-till gardening has become a very popular one where you simply add additives and compost to the top layer. And don't worry, because it will work its way down into your developing soil web year after year and give you really nice soil after a while. As far as the cultural controls of proper watering, this is really important. On the left here in this picture, it's a pretty plain picture, and let's just say probably they meant this to be grass, but let's just say this is any plant that you're growing. What you're looking for, what you hope to get, is roots that are deep. You want, because this whole area where the roots are is where the plant can take up nutrients and take up water. So you want that root for the plant to be as deep as possible, and the only way that's going to happen is if you water deeply. Because if you continually shallow water, for example, a small amount of water every day, you're going to end up with very shallow rooted plants, and they then have a very small area to take up water, to take up nutrients. And in the cases of some plants, a very shallow root system can cause them to be blown over or uprooted by severe wind situation. This would be, say, a larger plant. And so keep in mind that your watering should be deeper and less often. Now, on the right are two different ways to water. On the top, you have overhead watering. Most of us don't do that because this is asking for getting, of course, getting the leaves wet on the plant, and the leaves then, which do not dry thoroughly, can develop huge amounts of fungus problems, powdery mildew. It's asking for a problem. If you do a lot of overhead watering, especially in crop plants like tomatoes, for example, or even squash and cucumbers that have those great big leaves, you really are asking for a lot of problems if you're doing overhead watering. What you need to maybe think about is drip watering, which there's an example here. Now, this is not an raised bed, but certainly drip watering in a raised bed is a wonderful idea. You can then place the hoses, the drip hoses, wherever you want them, and you can turn them on for however long you want them, and hopefully, and then let them penetrate into the soil deeply enough so that your plants will develop this deep root system, which will allow them to pick up nutrients and water much more efficiently. And by the way, if you have to overhead water, do it in the morning so that then during the day, the plants can at least have a chance to dry out. Now, resistant varieties. That means plants that have either been bred or engineered to have resistant characteristics that make them less palatable for insects. And host plant resistance is actually broken down into 3 different categories, which I'll explain here in a second: non-preference, antibiosis, and tolerance. When it comes to non-preference, basically in English, it means that the insects don't like the plant for some reason. It tastes bad, it smells bad, it has little hairs on it that the insects don't care for, but somehow some characteristic that the insect doesn't like has been bred into the plant, and so the insects tend to stay away. Next is antibiosis, which makes the plant either makes the insect sick or dead. Or, by the way, it interferes with the insect's ability to reproduce. So something about the plant, either a chemical within or some kind of characteristic that has been bred into the plant, sickens the insect or makes its life history shorter. That's a very efficient way to keep the insects away from your plants. And the last one being tolerance. The plant is capable of tolerating or repairing insect damage better than a plant that is not resistant, and it still produces a crop for you, so that even if the insects are there and on the plant, the damage is not nearly as bad and you're still able to get a crop from them. Now, resistant varieties are not huge in number yet, and so you may need to search, but you have to decide in your own yard what are your main problems. For example, if you are trying to grow zucchini and you have huge amounts of powdery mildew on the leaves that are really interfering, and also probably bringing in white flies and aphids and other things that will all join in to make your plants look really yucky, you need to perhaps look to see if there are zucchini varieties that are resistant to powdery mildew. I know there are. I've never tried them. I don't know how the zucchini tastes. I'm sure it tastes fine, but you need to, if you want to try them, then it'll be an experiment for you. Perhaps you can grow both kinds and compare them in a given year, but there aren't huge numbers of resistant plants, but they are out there. So have a look if you really have garden problems that might be solved by this. Now, we're almost down towards the end here. We're adjusting the planting or harvest time to try to help our plants. And you need to first know your plants and what pests and diseases are affecting them. Because if you know the plant, then you know the diseases and pests that you're interested in, then you will be able to look them up and find out their life history. You need to know this. When does the pest emerge? Is it early? Is it late? How many generations does it have in a given year? If a pest has only one generation per year, then you can probably put up with whatever damage may occur early in the year when the pest's single generation comes out, and then you know you won't have to worry about it for the rest of the year. You can relax. You don't have to worry about trying to apply some kind of control mechanism because they'll be gone until the next year. If the pests emerge really early in the season, then you can, for example, plant a little bit later and avoid their early emergence. And the same goes if the pest emerges late. It's something that you need to know when you figure out which pests you are facing. Then also, second one down here is you can start seedlings indoors, either in a greenhouse, which is hopefully warm, or at least on heat mats, which keeps your plants warm and helps the seeds to emerge more quickly and grow a little more quickly, because a lot of damage occurring in the garden to seedlings is to small seedlings. For example, cutworms and worms that are in the soil that eat up little seedlings generally don't bother big plants. So little seedlings are the most delicate. And if you start them indoors, give them a start, get them bigger before you put them out, then that's probably one way to avoid the problems, especially with the worms. And as you can see down here, it will also help to avoid cool weather fungal diseases, which are going to be in existence, that cool weather, if you start planting early in the season, not indoors, but planting out in the garden early. You may run into fungus problems, damping off, etc., and planting inside may help this. You also can harvest early. Let's go back to talking about those zucchini. You can harvest them early and remove that big zucchini plant with its great big leaves, which may be starting to be covered with powdery mildew and whiteflies, and get rid of them, put them into your compost pile, assuming that your compost pile will get composted at a nice warm temperature, which can then kill those disease organisms and of course kill the whiteflies. And that way you will have less problems with whiteflies and powdery mildew overwintering in the soil, where next year you will be planting something else that doesn't need powdery mildew and whiteflies. So cultural controls of planting and harvest time are something that is often suggested for large agricultural crops, but can still be used by the home gardener. Lastly, but definitely not least, is cleanup time at the end of the year. Now I have a lot of pictures here of things that may be occurring in all of our yards. And that big picture in the center of the apples underneath the apple tree is my yard. And that's me at the end of the rake, because a lot of times if you happen to miss and you have a lot of falls of apples out of an apple tree and you put it off and you don't pick them up and they just sit there, even if there's not quite so many as there are here in my yard, you are asking for problems, because there are a lot of codling moths in apples in this area, apple scab, various diseases of apples, which can then, again, overwinter in your soil if you don't clean up those falls and get them out of the way. The same thing goes for cleaning up leaves, which may be diseased, and brush, and cleaning up brush piles, like the one over here on the right, which it's hard, because when you are pruning trees or pulling weeds, you need to move that brush into an area, either chip it or get it hauled away or compost it. And if you're going to compost it, you might want to keep the compost pile away from your main garden, because there are going to be pests in a compost pile no matter what. But you don't want to allow insects and other plant diseases to overwinter and be protected in a brush pile or a pile of dead leaves or branches, because that's where they're going to love to be. You don't want to allow them to have any more places than that. If a lot of people try to create brush piles if they happen to have large areas, acres of land, because brush piles are considered to be good housing for birds and animals, and they like to have this area, but keep it away from your garden if you and keep it as neat as possible. Branches rather than tiny little scrub and dead leaves, and then you can have the home for critters, as well as keep your yard as clean as possible. Now, that's pretty much it for this week as far as cultural controls. And next week, next Saturday, same time, same station, we will have discussions on mechanical controls, which is a really interesting topic. Physical barriers, preventive barriers, the tents that you can put over your deep beds, washing to wash pests off, traps, which you can trap with. Many are available. Hand picking, which some people might not want to do, but it's a really good idea. And the second area being biological controls, defined as follows: any activity of one species in it reduces the adverse effect of another. And of course, a lot of people love this particular topic, as do I. And we'll talk all about the various beneficials in the area and how to use them. And thank you all. I hope if you have any questions, you allow Margaret to share them with me. And after the talk is over at 10 o'clock, tune into the Master Gardeners and Friends radio program at KNCO 830 on your radio dial, AM. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Bonnie, thank you. So this concludes the main portion, and we can have Q&A now. And you enter those through the chat function. I've sent you a couple messages to do that. So Bonnie, we do have a question here that says, Bonnie, you just said that, or earlier, you can't use too much compost, as we know, but can you use too much worm castings, and how hot are worm castings?
Well, it depends on whom you get them from. For the most part, worm castings are not hot, because the worms have this is things that have gone through the worm and been digested by him or her and came out the other end. So for the most part, worm castings are great. And I would say, since they usually are a little bit expensive, unless you, of course, are making your own with your own worms, I would probably mix them with compost. And of course, many things that you buy in bags have worm castings mixed in. So I would say, for example, worm castings aren't nearly as hot as bat guano or various other manure from anything, chickens, rabbits, horses, cattle. All of those things are going to be hotter than worm castings. So I wouldn't worry about worm castings too much.
Great, thank you. I have another question here, and it's not about it's to how to connect to next week. So I just sent out a link to our website, which always has a link to the workshop each week. And then for ongoing meetings, stay tuned because we are going to be going back to having workshops at the demo garden. So keep checking, I know, in person. So keep checking our website for information on that. And you can also look at the website to see that the workshops that have been recorded, because there might be something that you missed. Oops, another question popped in about shelter for overwintering beneficial insects. I left my tall Gaillardia blanket flower stems standing last winter until I started seeing lady beetles in the garden, but I have a bad whitefly problem there. Should I cut those down this fall?
So I'm not sure whether she said she had a whitefly problem in the fall or in the winter.
No, I think the white fly problem came now, but
Okay.
last winter she left those stems up. And
I would say, since whiteflies are normally a later season problem, say at least toward the end of the summer, they should be a later season problem. If you're having them early, then that's a bad thing. So I think you would probably want to cut down the Gaillardia stems this year if you still have them. Don't leave them over winter. That sounds like that might be asking for trouble in your yard anyway.
Sounds good. Okay, I think that does it for questions. So I thank you, Bonnie, and the workshop will be posted online within the next week or so. And thank you to everyone who joined us this morning and for your interest in our Master Gardeners and our programs. We appreciate it.